Hello, my name is Dan Hennen. Today is December 21st, 2018, and we've got three special guests joining us on the show tonight to give us an update on the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And the panel here tonight will start off with here. I'll give an introduction on each of the three guests joining us tonight. First is Richard Gage. Now, Richard Gage is he's a San Francisco Bay Area architect and member of the American Institute of Architects. He is the founding member of Architects and Engineers for 9/11Truth. Mr. Gage became interested in researching the deconstruction of the WTC high-rises after hearing the startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher, David Ray Griffin, on the radio in 2006, which launched his own unyielding quest for the truth about 9/11. AE911Truth now numbers more than 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center high-rise buildings on 9/11. Next we'll have David Meiswinkle, attorney. David Meiswinkle is the chairman of the board and the founding member of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. He is a U.S. Army veteran, a former New Jersey police officer of 23 years, and has been a criminal defense attorney in New Jersey since 1989. In 2009, he ran as an independent for governor of New Jersey against Chris Christie, and was the only candidate who spoke of the need for a new 9/11 investigation. In 2010, he ran as an independent for Congress, again exposing the need for a new independent 9/11 investigation. Along with colleague and friend Pamela Senzi, David walked 440 miles to and between the three 9/11 crime scenes as a dedication to the victims of 9/11 and for the restoration of our Constitution. They are completing the film Truth Walk, which documents this historic journey while exposing the truth about 9/11, explores the current world condition, and offers solutions in a post-9/11 paradigm. And then we've got Barbara Honegger. She'll be on here. Barbara worked as a researcher and a policy analyst in 1980 with the Ronald Reagan administration. While working for Reagan, she discovered information that convinced her that George H.W. Bush and William Casey had conspired to make sure that Iran did not release the U.S. hostages until Jimmy Carter had been defeated in the 1980 presidential election. Honegger published the book October Surprise in 1989. In her book, Honegger claimed that in 1980, William Casey and other representatives of the Reagan presidential campaign made a deal at two sets of meetings in July and August at the Ritz Hotel in Madrid with Iranians to delay the release of Americans held hostage in Iran until after the November 1980 presidential elections. Reagan's aides promised that they would get a better deal if they waited until Carter was defeated. These are the three on the panel we'll have, and welcome to the show, Richard, and welcome to the show, David Meiswinkle and Barbara Honegger.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Would you mind if I add to my bio what matters for this show?
Yes, Barbara.
Okay, because October Surprise is really not relevant to the show, except that it shows that I'm a crackerjack researcher and author. But people need to know that in addition to that, most importantly, both Dave and I are on the board of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. He's the president and chairman of the board, and I'm on the board. Ever since 9/11, the day of itself, I've been out there in the public domain, even while I was working for the Department of Defense. Forgive me, I'm going to ignore that call. I'm going to have to turn down my phone. Forgive me.
Hello, can I please speak?
Jeez. Forgive me. I forgot to turn down my phone. Anyway, the other thing you should know is that I was a high-level high-level employee in the White House, the West Wing of the White House, and the Department of Justice. So I worked in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, right under the Attorney General of the United States. So that's relevant to the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And also for about 16 years, a little bit over, I was the senior military affairs journalist for the Department of Defense's Premier Science, Technology, and National Security Affairs Graduate Research University. So those are far more relevant to this program than my book, October Surprise.
Very good, very good. And so how about, for tonight's show, we're going to be speaking about the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, and number one, what it is, and number two, the latest updates and developments. And Barbara, would you give a good overview here a little bit, just to encapsulate for the listeners what it is we're dealing with?
Right. Well, what's so exciting, and I know that our president of the Lawyers Committee, Dave Meiswinkle, who here is on this call, is going to give you a lot more detail from the attorney's point of view. I'm not an attorney, though I worked in the Department of Justice at a very high level in the 1980s. So the bottom line is this. For over 17 years, the 9/11 Truth movement, researchers, investigators, scholars, whistleblowers coming forward, eyewitnesses, we have pulled together the forensic evidence of what really happened at the World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center 7 on 9/11. And what the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry has done and is continuing to do, big time, is to put all of that information together in a legal package. And that legal package is called the Grand Jury Petition, which the Lawyers Committee submitted to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. That is the federal jurisdiction for Ground Zero on 9/11 for the World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center 7. We submitted a petition of over 50 pages with all of the forensic evidence, fully documented, fully referenced and cited, and attached to it as part of it are 57 exhibits, evidentiary exhibits. Those went to the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, demanding a federal special criminal grand jury be convened so that 23 patriotic, extraordinary, ordinary Americans will soon be seeing that evidence and deciding for themselves who they can identify as the real perpetrators of these horrendous attacks that killed almost 3,000 Americans on 9/11. So the exciting news that we're here about today is that on, believe it or not, November 7th of this year, that's not that long ago, about a month and a half, on November 7th of 2018, and we're now talking to you on December 21st, 2018, Dan, on November 7th of this year, 2018, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York sent the Lawyers Committee an official signed letter stating that the U.S. Attorney would comply with the federal statute that requires him to convene and submit our grand jury petition and our evidentiary exhibits to a special federal criminal grand jury. And that is now going to happen. So we are announcing that on your program today, and we are asking people throughout this program for their donations on our two websites, which is the Architects and Engineers website and the Lawyers Committee website, for your generous donations through the end of December in our joint fundraising campaign so that we can take full advantage of this phenomenal historic opportunity.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And I also have a link up here that's showing right now on the screen of the various all of the exhibits in this case, and also the website of the Lawyers Committee. So I'll be scrolling through some of that as the panel is speaking.
Okay.
Well, David, would you like to go talk a little bit about your background in this case, and from an attorney's perspective, how is this and how important is this case for us going forward for the public?
Yes, this is extremely important. It is a litmus test as to whether the system can work. Many of us have had experiences where it seems like it's not working. And in this case, 17 years ago, the most egregious crime ever inflicted on the United States, killing almost 3,000 people, was committed. And there has never been a proper criminal investigation, never been a grand jury convened to look into the evidence. What's been put forth right now, the hypothesis of the government and the justification for basically the state of affairs in many ways that exist today, is based on, how should I say it, fallacious or information or evidence that would never muster itself in a court of law. What we're presenting in the petition and the exhibits is evidence that shows conclusively that explosions occurred in the buildings, that bombs and controlled demolition was involved in bringing the towers down. That's the North Tower, Building 1, and the South Tower, Building 2, and Building 7, WTC 7. They were brought down in part through explosions and controlled demolitions, and not, as the government story is, through office fires. Now, they've said that office fires, which were caused by the jet fuel of the airplanes crashing into the two big towers, and then just simple office fires from Building 7 that was never hit by an airplane. So this is the story that exists today in history. And this grand jury petition and the exhibit will rewrite history to the benefit of all the people in this country. The paramount interest there is truth. Once we find the truth, then it's time for justice.
And David, when was this petition first filed? It was earlier this year, I believe it was in April.
Yes, it was. Thanks for asking that question. We filed that in April 10th of this year, the 52-page petition with the 57 exhibits. And those exhibits could take you a long time to go through, but they're excellent. One of the exhibits has to do with the firefighters' testimony. And there's 118 firemen that basically make statements that they experienced and heard explosions in the building. That in itself is stunning, and that the American people don't know that. It was followed up then an amended petition. It amended it to include different crimes. The first petition talked about federal law criminalizing bombings of places of public use and government facilities. Then we wanted to make it stronger, and it then included, as of July 30th, the federal law criminalizing providing support to terrorists, federal law criminalizing acts of terrorism transcending national boundaries, and federal law criminalizing the killing of a federal government agent and or employee. Now, these crimes all have charges to or subcharges of conspiracy and aiding and abetting. So that was filed then on July 30th. On November 7th, we received this letter. The Lawyers Committee did. We have received and reviewed the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry submission of April 10th and July 30th, 2018. We will comply with the provisions of 18 U.S.C. 3332 as they relate to your submission. And very truly yours, Jeffrey S. Berman, United States Attorney, and it's signed by Michael Ferrara, and then he has a name, Elon Graff, below that, and they are the chiefs of terrorism and international narcotics unit, and this is in the Southern District Court of Manhattan. That's where we submitted it. Now, the code that it covers is 18 U.S.C. 3332, and that says it shall be the duty of each such grand jury impaneled with any judicial district to inquire into offenses against the criminal laws of the United States alleged to have been committed within that district. Such alleged offenses may be brought to the attention of the grand jury by the court or by any attorney appearing on behalf of the United States for the presentation of evidence. Any such attorney receiving information concerning such an alleged offense from any other person shall, if requested by such other person, inform the grand jury of such alleged offense, the identity of such other person, and such attorney's action or recommendation. How this is interpreted is that, and Barbara mentioned it when she began, is that this isn't just a permissiveness on the part of the U.S. Attorney and they can decide whether they want to present this or not. This is an obligation, mandatory obligation. And if it's not done, there is possible follow-up. Now, they represent they're going to do it, so that's great, and that's what we want to happen. But there's an action called a mandamus action, which you can file in court if you believe you have to, and which acts as a federal judge to review this and to command the U.S. Attorney to do his job, to his duty. And his duty here, according to the law, is to present the evidence that was given him to the grand jury.
Now, David, when I bring this up to friends and family, the first two questions I usually get is, are there defendants named in this, and is there going to be a trial, a public trial? And I try to say that there's nothing mentioned as far as defendants, because this isn't an actual trial yet. This is just a petition that's going to be presented to the grand jury members. And as of after that takes place, there could very well be an indictments and things like that would come forth from that. But this is actually done in secret. This it's a private. The case is presented in private. It isn't something that's going to be on the nightly news or we can watch on television. Correct?
You're right, 100%. As the amendment, the Fifth Amendment of the United States says, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. So what the grand jury is, this is not a complaint as such. This is a petition. And what it's doing is it's bringing what we call a evidence, which is reasonable, but it's we're asking them the standard that the grand jury has to follow is probable cause, and that's a standard of basically reasonable suspicion. That if they have that, they can then bring an official charge, which would be an indictment, and then you would have your trial. So what this has to do, they have to do two things. Well, they have to do a lot more than two, I'm sure, but two of the things that are pretty extremely important and necessary is that they first have to review the material we've gotten and compare it with the official story. They have to start their own investigation. They have, if they believe that an investigation is entitled, and we believe that once they see this evidence, it's so jaw-dropping that stunning in a sense that they will proceed with the investigation, and they have unlimited subpoena powers. They can subpoena anyone they want to come in here and testify for them. They can bring experts in, and they can subpoena documents of all sorts, from telephone records to credit card records to email records or whatever. So in part, when we talked about conspiracies and things of that nature, they can go back years, and a lot of this evidence may be available, and people maybe thought that never would be, surfaced like this, because apparently a lot of people thought that this would never happen, that that grand jury would actually be convened. So after you review your evidence and you have some possible suspects lined up, then you can eventually go in for the indictment. The length of this could be at least 18 months or longer, and we will be hopefully working with them. We provided them with a letter not too long ago, and we told them we want to help them in any way we can, whether we would like to present to them if allowed, and we would like to get the architects and engineers and their experts certainly involved in these presentations. So to respond to your friends that this is not a trial, this precedes a trial, and a trial can't be held until we can indict people, and they have to do an investigation to determine if there's people to indict, who to indict. We will be giving information to the grand jury as far as people of material information. These are people that would be advisable to talk to get a sense of the nature of the crime and take some leads from there. And that's being done in the process right now by the Lawyers Committee.
Very good. Now, I'd like to move forward with Richard Gage. One thing with Richard and his group called Architects and Engineers for 911Truth is that this group is the foremost. It's a leading group here with as far as researching 9/11 going back, and their focus is basically World Trade Centers 1, 2, and 7. Their group is not looking at the Pentagon, not looking at Shanksville, but has focused on what they are experts on. Richard, can you give us a little background on that? Richard, are you there?
Here we are. Yeah, thanks, Dan. There's a reason we have 3,000 architects and engineers for demanding a new investigation into the destruction of these 3 skyscrapers. And the reason we focus on the 3 skyscrapers is because the evidence is so clear. The forensic evidence and eyewitness testimony that the grand jury is going to see is irrefutable. We have private citizens that are going to be called out of their lives probably for a long time, because this is a huge set of cases. And they're going to be looking, first of all, at World Trade Center Building 7. And this is the 3rd skyscraper to collapse on 9/11, which most architects and engineers are completely unaware of, because the American Institute of Architects did not even issue one letter or document about the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. It's unconscionable. Here's a 47-story skyscraper that on the afternoon of 9/11 at 5:20 p.m., this high-rise, which was not hit by an airplane, nevertheless, after witnesses hear explosions, the building drops straight down suddenly, smoothly, symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. And this happens at free fall. It's exactly like the old hotels in Las Vegas, for instance, when you see them on TV. And so when the grand jury sees this, they're going to go, oh my God, just like everybody else who sees it for the first time. That sure looks like a controlled demolition. And sure enough, the evidence shows exactly that. We're talking about massive dust clouds of heat created by heat, smoke clouds expanding in cauliflower-shaped forms, which are expanding 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. And that's true for the Twin Towers as well, by the way. Incredible quantities of heat. But the few small scattered fires, which NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, blames for the cause of the collapse of this 3rd tower, normal office fires, they're just here and there. They can't possibly remove all 80 columns on each floor, which is what's required to bring a building down suddenly, smoothly, and symmetrically. And yes, we have the evidence of incendiaries in the aftermath and the pile of this building, documented by first responders, structural engineers, iron workers, documented by FEMA themselves, who talk about the ends of the beams being partially evaporated. That takes 4,000 degree temperatures. A hot corrosion attack on the steel with sulfur. Where did the sulfur come from? They don't even know. And where does the extreme heat come from to melt the ends of the beams, which is described in this metallurgical examination in Appendix C of their Building Performance Assessment Report that came out in May of 2002. I'm telling you, this evidence that the grand jury is going to be seeing is absolutely indictable. There's somebody who's going to be found guilty here somewhere. We don't know who that is, but the attorneys are going to be providing important amendments to this petition called Persons of Material Interest, that they can start to learn some facts from, such as Larry Silverstein, the building's owner, who secured all of the World Trade Center in addition to Building 7, which he had built in the 80s. Just 6 weeks prior to 9/11, He bought the whole shebang and put massive insurance on it. There's a lot to go on here. So then we're going to show the grand jury what happened to build the Twin Towers, because we're told in the case of the Twin Towers that they came down by jet fuel and plane impacts. But jet fuel only burns 600 degrees according to its manufacturer in open air. So it's not responsible for the tons and tons and tons of molten iron, which is documented by so many sources in the base of these piles down in the basement. And we have molten concrete, which has never before been seen in fires outside of incendiaries. By the way, thermite, which there is evidence for in these towers, is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. And we have the evidence of that not only in the metallurgical examination with a hot sulfur corrosion attack and liquid molten iron invading the steel, but we have it found by the U.S. Geological Survey, who is documenting the toxicological, in their toxicological studies of the dust, they document molten iron microspheres, 10 tons of them, in the World Trade Center dust. They have no awareness of where those might have come from, but they determine that it's a distinguishing element of the dust itself. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these curious previously molten iron microspheres about the diameter of a human hair. And this is also documented by R.J. Lee that says these are formed during the event. Well, all this is completely obscured by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain the collapses, all three of them, to the American people, how and why. But they didn't do that. They have their own mission here. Their objective is hidden in a footnote 82 on page 13. What does it say? It says, we're just looking at the events up to the initiation of collapse. They have no this is just pure speculation. They have no analysis on how this building actually collapsed itself. That's what Congress tasked them to do, but they completely avoid it. They simply say in a 1/2-page statement that it came down at free fall because the mass below was unable to resist the falling mass up above. So what is their theory? Their theory is that there's a 15-story section above the point of jet plane impact, in the case of the North Tower, that drove the rest of the building down to the ground after fire weakened the floor trusses and pulled in the perimeter columns, and then it destroys itself, this 15-story section. Well, that disobeys the law of the conservation of momentum, Dan. You can't have it that way. What actually happens, if you look at the videos, there's no section that's driving the rest of the building down to the ground. It's destroyed itself in the first 4 seconds, telescoping in on itself. After that, you have massive explosions again, which both preceded the collapse. These 118 firefighters that Dave referred to are preceding the collapse, most of them. It's very clear in the language of these witnesses. And then after 4 seconds, you have more explosions hurling laterally ejected, freely flying structural steel sections at 80 miles an hour laterally. Gravity works down, but this is out, and 600 feet around each of these towers, the steel is. So you have the steel distributed outside the footprint, and you have the concrete pulverized to a fine powder in midair, because there's no stack of concrete floors down at the bottom, not 100, not 50, not one. They're pulverized in midair to a fine ash and distributed in a 3-square-mile area from river to river across lower Manhattan. So if you have all of the concrete and the steel distributed outside the footprints of these buildings, which is 2/3 of the weight of this building, both of them, what is driving the building down to the ground at any rate? And It's just not there. It's gone. The building is destroying itself. And each of them in 12 seconds, completely shattering the structure from top to bottom to their individual structural elements, which is identified by the NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, Guide 921, which is the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, which says look for high order damage, which can cause the shattering of the structure. And this is not part of the analysis done by NIST. So the grand jury is in for a huge awakening. And of course, this material, which we just only touched on here, we have a whole video on this subject, which really only touches on it, and it's 90 minutes. That's 9/11 explosive evidence experts speak out. So this is why the attorneys have to put more hours, hundreds of hours of work into preparing this testimony, the credentials and the expert testimony of these expert witnesses, and additional motions and amendments, all filed under the petition, so the U.S. Attorney has to give it directly to the grand jury. And that's why we have to have our listeners supporting this incredible effort that the attorneys are now up against the wall to create a whole team of them. So that's why we're raising funds for this project, and it's extremely important. A historical opportunity. The window is open right now. Let's fund these attorneys, and we can do that at lc for911.org or at AE911Truth.org. A joint venture, if you will, a joint project between the architects, engineers, and the attorneys for this incredible window of opportunity.
And I think just to reiterate that this donation is also it is tax deductible. The group is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So for those wanting to get their donations in here before the end of the year, it's a perfect time to do so as well. And
both organizations are 501c3s, and it doesn't matter which website you donate to, because we're sharing the funds.
Yes, it's very interesting. And Richard, just to follow up on yours. On your discussion, what I find in talking with people about 9/11 is they're surprised to know that there was thermitic materials in the dust, and that's nanothermite. That's not something you're going to find anywhere around the city, anywhere in the country. That's a military laboratories where those types of things are made. And if that was in the building, or in this case, all three, the next question that I get a lot is how long would it have taken to either wire the buildings or paint that on or get that, that would have been a multiple week project to get all of that done, correct?
It's a huge task. It would take months. In fact, there was a elevator retrofit going on the 9 months prior to 9/11 that the grand jury will be made aware of too, which involved the ACE elevator. And they had this contract. They came out of nowhere to get this contract, by the way. Otis Elevator was the company maintaining these elevators. Well, the elevators are right adjacent to the core columns in each of the Twin Towers and would have provided the perfect undercover operation. In fact, the ACE elevator employees fled as soon as the first plane hit the first tower. It was actually quite a scandal documented in USA Today. They had the opportunity to help the first responders, but they did not. So, yes, they had the opportunity in those 9 months to place the materials which a team of scientists led by Neil Harrett and Stephen Jones found in all the dust samples, 7 of them, that they collected independently, and they find the same red-gray chips. They look like paint. They're fluid applied because of their dual layered, and they find when they analyze them that they have the ingredients of thermite in them, which is iron oxide and aluminum powders. But they get real curious, zoom in 50,000 times with an electron microscope, and they find that these powders are at the nano scale. Aluminum platelets and rhomboidally shaped iron oxide crystals that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of the human hair. So these are nanothermite particles very clearly, because when they put them in a differential scanning calorimeter, a heater at 420 degrees Celsius, they ignite, producing very intense energy, which produces what, by the way? It produces the same molten iron microspheres that R.J. Lee, the environmental consulting firm, and the U.S. Geological Survey document up to 10 tons of that material in the World Trade Center dust. Don't know where it is, but here it is reproduced when they put these chips in a heater. So it's very clear where they come from. So we have a repeatable set of experimental data that's self-corroborating that could show exactly who might be responsible for this massive crime. As you suggested, this is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is made only by the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. It's all in a peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, and it's all laid out there in this 25-page peer-reviewed paper, which has not been contested by any other peer-reviewed paper.
Now, Richard, how frequent is it that steel-framed office buildings collapse due to office fires? Is that something that's common, or is that something that's ever happened before?
Never before 9/11, and actually never on 9/11, because that's not what happened on 9/11, as the evidence shows, and as the grand jury will see. We've had 100 fires in skyscrapers that have been very serious. In fact, most of them much larger, longer lasting, and hotter than the Twin Towers, like Building 5, for instance, which was fully engulfed, one of the World Trade Center buildings, in fire. It didn't come down either. So if any of them were going to come down due to fires, we'd expect it to be that one. So yeah, we've got a real set of jaw-dropping evidence here for this grand jury.
Now, David, as far as 9/11, we've got 3 crime scenes. The evidence here in the exhibits that are presented in this petition are mainly in Manhattan there for the Twin Tower complex. And does it also have cases there in Shanksville or at the Pentagon?
No, again, that would be separate investigations and separate grand juries at this point in time.
I see.
Right now, this grand jury is just directed, the evidence is just directed at the WTC Center and the theory that the explosive bombs, controlled demolition, were the cause of the collapse of those buildings.
I see. So that's why it was presented there in the Southern District of New York, because that is
exactly
the location.
Now, to go along with what Richard said, is and thinking that the standard thus far has been the 9/11 Commission report that Philip Zelikow oversaw and Tom Kane was involved with, and Lee Hamilton. But some of the things they failed to do, and I just would list some of them, was they failed to secure the scene. If you think back then, they cut the metal down and shipped it overseas, and that would be very telling as far as a forensic study there of the distortion and the mottling and the devastation of that metal, and that was seemed to be an intention to get rid of that crime scene. The first thing you learn as a police officer is to preserve a crime scene, and I was a police officer for 23 years. Now, they failed to prevent the spoliation of evidence, and that's, Richard alluded to, the National Fire Standard. In this kind of catastrophic event, that would be something that certainly you would be looking at the intent for explosives and accelerants and things of that nature. So they failed to test for those things, for explosions, explosives, and accelerants. They failed to analyze the dust, and as Richard mentioned, the nanothermite, the red-gray chip, indicative of nanothermite, and ask the question is who could be responsible for putting that nanothermite in that complex. They failed to explain the tremendous heat, as Richard mentioned. It's the melting point of steel is much higher than any kind of gasoline, either from an airplane or anywhere else. You need, my understanding, at least another 1,000 degrees of temperature. So where would that temperature come from? And if the logical explanation or the next step would be to consider other possibilities than office fires, which would be impossible, so it would logically take you to explosives and things of that nature. They failed to account for the free fall. And architects and engineers do brilliantly. David Chandler is that person who's actually measured the free fall. He's an expert in the area of the physical sciences. And they failed to explain the molten metal. And Richard tell you about the molten metal. That it has to be hot, super hot, to be able to create that. Office fires can't do that. And they failed to include in the Building 7 report the stifter plates and the shear studs and the lateral beams and the proper seating capacity. In other words, they fudged and lied to report. I think Tony Zambati was involved he's a mechanical engineer associated with architects and engineers. And Richard, you could correct me if I'm wrong, or if somebody else should get credit. But I think Tony was involved in exposing that lie to make them have to correct their error. And they failed to explain the free fall, as I mentioned before, in not only just Building 7, which was measured at that 2.3 seconds, free falling, I believe, 8 stories over 100 feet, and the big towers each fell down at approximately free fall. They couldn't explain that. They failed to call the witnesses, the firemen. As Richard mentioned, 118 firemen who experienced explosives before the buildings came down. That's incredible. And people like Willie Rodriguez, who testified before that commission, they didn't include his testimony in the report. And what was his testimony? Well, we'll include it in our exhibits. It had to do with the explosions in the basement before the plane struck. There was explosions in the basement, serious explosions, and in the lobby before the airplane struck the World Trade Center 1 and 2. And there was also the testimony of Barry Jennings, who experienced explosions in Building 7 earlier on, way before it finally came down at 5:20. There was failure to explain the advanced warnings, like with Jane Stanley or in BBC, where she's all of a sudden saying that Building 7 has collapsed and it's behind her, and a live shot behind her for another 25 minutes before it goes down. And and as was previously mentioned, and you mentioned it, Dan, this never happened before. The architects and the engineers know that steel-structured high-rises can't collapse because of fires. They can collapse if they're used explosions and things of that nature and controlled demolition. So some of those failures, and this is only just a short list of different failures the government performed at with their 9/11 investigation, which wasn't a criminal investigation. And this has been the law of the land thus far. This has been the conventional wisdom thus far. This has been the foolery that people have believed this nonsense, if not outright, well, I'll say outright lies and fabrications.
Yeah, like you mentioned with World Trade Center number 7, Barry Jennings was in that building, and he was stepping over dead bodies already earlier that day before the building came down and before any impacts were even made. And so, like with the Bobby McIlvaine Act as well, that's getting pushed through, hopefully, where his son was killed as far as down in that lobby of the Trade Center Tower before the plane even was impacted. So, now, my question for you, David, from a legal attorney perspective, how long do you foresee it would take now for this grand jury to be assembled? Just getting these 23 people together, is that part of that 18 months, or is the 18-month time window begin once the jury members are selected?
Yeah, we've not been down this before, but based on my experience in distant criminal trials, they would have to ordeer the grand jurors. That might take a while, maybe it won't. And I believe that once they are sworn in, that's when the time because they have an obligation, they have to report so frequently. And in order to do business, they need at least 16 of the 23 there. and again, they're going to be sitting for maybe a year and a half, or maybe even longer. I don't believe it would start until they're sworn in. And again, we don't know how long it would take to get a reasonable, objective grouping of people.
Now, Barbara, going forward with this, you've been very active in all of this as well, doing various interviews and getting the word out. I've been sharing it as well. I know we've listed already the various websites to get a hold of. I think those exhibits is very interesting to go through, because that is not presented, just to the grand jury, but that's available for the general public, for you and I to read and go through each of those exhibits out there on the website. Is there any other social media? Is there a Twitter account or a Facebook account associated with this organization?
You mean with the lawyers? You mean with the Lawyers Committee?
Correct.
We have our website, and that's where people donate. Either our website, which is www.lcfor911.org, or they can donate to our joint fundraising project for the Lawyers Committee, also at the Architects and Engineers website, which is AE911Truth.org. Those are the two websites. I can tell you the good news that after we received the November 7th letter from the U.S. Attorney for the federal court there in Lower Manhattan, the federal jurisdiction for Ground Zero and crimes on 9/11, after we received his November 7th letter to the Lawyers Committee, it took a little while for us to decide our next step. And when we put out our press release, which I put out on behalf of the Lawyers Committee through an organization called PR Newswire, and that went to a maximum number of viewers of over 8.5 million. And within 24 hours or less, actually less, our press release, including the embedded hyperlinks to our petition, our grand jury petition, to our grand jury evidentiary exhibits, and to the U.S. Attorney's letter itself. Our press release with all those embedded links that were live were picked up and reproduced, posted in toto as is on over 160 mainstream newspaper and television channel and television and radio websites across the country, mainstream media.
Well, that is excellent. That is good. That's very good news to get this out there, because it's going to be a very exciting time to see how this follows along. And
yeah, I would like to add.
Yes.
I believe that Dave mentioned earlier. I think he said that there's never been a grand jury for 9/11. I think it would be safe to say that we don't know that for certain. Grand juries are secret. So there may have well been some grand juries that no one would know about, because grand juries by definition are some of the most secret proceedings in the United States government. Okay. So it's possible there were grand juries, but it's certainly the case, as far as we know in the public domain, that there haven't been any that we know of, except for ours.
And these and the 23 individuals that will be selected here down the road are also not going to be able to speak or talk about the case, just like as with any being a juror on any case. But once it's over and it's completed, then they are free to speak about it freely. Is that correct?
Well, my understanding is if they want to, witnesses can speak freely. According
Gotcha.
to our litigation director, Mick Harrison, who's not on this particular interview, he has told us that it's his understanding from reviewing the law and the history of the grand juries and their procedures that any witness is free to talk. As far as the grand jurors themselves are concerned, I think that's more questionable. I'm not sure that he said that, but we can double check.
David, can you chime in on that?
Yeah, I would. My gut reaction is that they probably could, but I don't know if they're sworn that they can't. At that time, it's a secret proceeding. If sometime later, when that proceeding's all done, if somebody wants to write a book or do something about it, that's a good question. We'll have to look into it. My gut is that probably they could. I don't think they're sworn to secrecy forever. During that period of time, they are, but I can't give you a a complete answer on that.
What we will know publicly is if there are any indictments that come out of the grand jury. That would be public, almost certainly.
Okay. And then at that point, things really begin getting interesting. At that point, now, I've read through this and gone through the exhibits myself, and it's nice because it's slam dunk facts. It's done in a very professional way, and it's unbelievable, actually, what it is. So. It'll be very interesting. Now, Richard, do you have any final comments here on this episode from your perspective from AE911Truth?
Yeah, I think it's really important that people realize why we're doing this. We're not talking about who destroyed the buildings. In fact, what we're talking about is more important, believe it or not, than who murdered 3,000 people. What we're talking about here is the aftermath of 9/11 changed the world as we know it. We're engaged in a $6 trillion global war on terror as a result of these impacts of these planes into these buildings and the controlled demolition that followed. We're talking about invading two countries in which 2 million Muslims have been murdered. We're talking about the loss certainly in the Western countries of our civil liberties, where here in the United States we can be arrested now without a right to a lawyer, a jury, a trial. We can even be tortured and even assassinated as American citizens without due process. This is unconscionable. This is the state of affairs right now as a result of 9/11 through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, and the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. So they have set us up, these what I'll just call deep state perpetrators, because as Barbara can clarify, we're not talking about fundamentalist hijackers setting explosives in these extremely high security buildings, all three of them, very high security buildings. We're talking about some sort of an inside operation, which involves a deep state operation, which these indictments can root out if these 23 citizens have the courage to overcome the pressure that'll be upon them, probably by the U.S. attorney and if not others. So we all have to be hoping and praying for due process here, and that it does not get corrupted as well.
Yes, and people need to understand that every single one of the 9/11 wars that are based upon the lie, the official lie of who attacked America, our country, on 9/11, that those wars still continue. And the official legal, so-called, I put legal in quotes, rationale and justification for the continuing, over 17 years later, 9/11 wars, and we're talking about everything that's happening in the Middle East, everything, to this day, even in Syria. These are all justified based upon the authorization of the use of military force, the federal statute that was railroaded through Congress before, at midnight, before the congresspersons could even read it, only 3 days after 9/11. On September 14th. To this day, the AUMF, signed by passed by Congress under the lie of who attacked our country on 9/11, is still the rationale for what has caused over 2 million deaths, many, many more million displaced persons, and the migration crisis that is tearing Europe apart. People need to understand that what we are doing here actually can change the world.
Very interesting. Very good.
And that's why we've got to have everybody hearing this interview respond in one manner or another. Tell somebody about the evidence that you've heard tonight. Send them to the AE911Truth.org website, the LC911, the LC4911.org website, to either volunteer or donate. Whatever you can do, do something.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting with all this going on, and for those who want to be part of something, what I would call it a historical thing, to be able to donate and participate and volunteer, and because this is going to be very, very huge down the road. Any final thoughts, David Meiswinkle, on this case?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that this grand jury petition has the possibility to rewrite history. As both Richard and Barbara mentioned, all the calamities that happened since that time, we have to rewind that and go back to our roots as Americans. What we are doing in the world, unfortunately, is un-American, and we're handling this travesty of injustice to our own people in the most un-American way. We have to, as we like to say, as a model for the Lawyers Committee, is transparency and accountability. We need that here in this issue of the 9/11 crimes. The first, or the crime scene we're dealing with right now before us is the New York City crimes at Ground Zero, as was mentioned before, and that would be stupendous and outrageous enough just in that part. But we have to also realize that this is part of a network of crimes that happened that day, and that there are other crime areas, as you mentioned before, Dan, in the Pentagon and Shanksville. We're not mentioning that, but the Lawyers Committee realizes that. We want to do the best job we can to help get to the truth here in New York City, and we want to. Our mission is transparency and accountability in government as it pertains to the 9/11 and the 9/11 investigations that have been done thus far. So that means we have to move on at some time from this area, but we can't do that until we have some kind of closure here in New York, at least understanding that there's a process going to get to the truth. So shows like your own really help it, and people like that I'm associated with, like Barbara and Richard. These are historical personalities
right.
at this time in our day. And as I said before, this could be at some time in the future, or maybe even rather presently, an historical venture. And anyone that wants to contribute to help this move forward, it's not just to address these outrageous crimes, but it's also, in the language of many, is to get our country back, to get it on the proper footing, and to abide by our Constitution and Bill of Rights.
That's right. What we're about is making America America again.
Very well stated. Now, Barbara, any final words on your behalf?
Well, I'd just like to point out to people that if you are students of history, Winston Churchill had a famous slogan, and that is that every once in a while, there is what he called a hinge of history, Hinge, a hinge of history, like the hinge on a gate. And we are at a hinge of history here. And people need to become active. They need to participate to make sure that that hinge of history swings in the right direction and takes us back to being able to make America America again.
Well, very good. I'm thrilled to have you three on here. I consider you, all three of you, American heroes and American patriots for doing what you're doing. And after looking through the exhibits myself, it is very interesting, like I said, because it certainly shows you what did happen on 9/11, and also, more importantly, what did not happen on 9/11. And so when you review these exhibits, and some of them are even videos, and the rest I think are just PDF files, go through or look at them all with an open mind, and it's very interesting. I'd like to thank you all three for your time tonight, and I'll ask the viewers of this to leave any comments below on the comments section, or ask any questions about these three individuals. But Richard Gage, thank you. David Meiswinkle, thank you. And Barbara Honegger, thank you.
I would like to add, Dan, if I could.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, I would just like to add that for anyone who feels moved to donate, and I hope all of your listeners are, you can go to either of the two websites again. That's AE911Truth.org or LC4911.org. And the message is, our joint fundraising campaign is through the end of December. So please, if you're going to donate, try to do so by then. Thank you.
Very good. And I will post those links for the sites as well in the description for this.
Great.
Very good. Well, my name is Dan Hennen. Today is December 21st, 2018. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.